You can't understand the life of a Soviet sniper without first understanding the world they were dropped into, a world that was colder, harsher, and more merciless than almost anything in modern warfare. The Eastern Front wasn't just a battlefield, it was a black hole of suffering, a place where hope froze in the air, and every breath felt like it could be your last. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The cold that killed without bullets. Imagine stepping into the winter of 1942. The wind howls like an angry spirit. Snowdrifts reach higher than the roofs of broken buildings. The temperature, minus 40 degrees Celsius. You took off your gloves for more than a few minutes, your fingers would go numb. A little longer, and they'd turn black with frostbite. And yet, as a Soviet sniper, you couldn't afford to stay warm. You didn't have the luxury of heavy winter coats like modern soldiers. Your camouflage was thin, designed for stealth, not comfort. You'd lie on the frozen ground for hours, sometimes days, without moving. The cold seeped into your bones until you couldn't tell where your body ended and the ice began. Rifles froze, too. Soviet Mosin-Nagants were sturdy, but in this weather, metal contracted, scopes fogged up, bolts locked in place. Snipers had to urinate on their rifle bolts to thaw them. Yes, you heard that right. You literally had to warm your weapon with your own body heat just to keep it functional. Some soldiers would tie bits of cloth to their triggers, so their bare fingers didn't touch the icy steel. They slipped and their skin made contact with metal. It would stick, rip away, and you'd lose skin. All of this just before you even saw an enemy. Hunger that never stopped. And let's talk about hunger. Food was a cruel joke. Soviet rations during the siege of Stalingrad, for example, dropped as low as 250 grams of bread per day. And this wasn't fresh bread. It was a black, heavy brick of sawdust and flour, barely enough to keep a grown man alive. When you're lying in wait for 12, 15, even 20 hours without moving, you're burning calories. Your body shivers constantly to stay warm, but there's no energy to replace what you're losing. Some snipers described catching rats or birds and roasting them in hidden fires. Others chewed on leather belts or boots to stave off hunger pains. Imagine trying to steady your aim when your stomach is twisting itself into knots. And even if you did get a warm meal from the field kitchen, it was usually a thin, watery soup filled with mystery meat or, sometimes, no meat at all. The stench of the front. You know what else was in the air? Smell. And it wasn't just smoke from burning cities. It was death. Rotting corpses littered the snow. Both Soviet and German bodies piled up because it was too dangerous to retrieve them. Dogs and rats gnawed on the dead. The smell of decay mixed with unwashed uniforms, sweat, blood, and the sour odor of fear. Snipers didn't get to escape this smell. In fact, they were often forced to hide near corpses because it was the best camouflage. Imagine lying perfectly still for hours next to a frozen, stiffened body. You're breathing in the stench, knowing that's what you could look like by the end of the day. Disease, lice, and rot. Now, add lice to the equation. Every soldier was crawling with them. No matter how often you deloused your clothes, the bugs came back. They carried disease. They itched constantly. You couldn't sleep without feeling them biting. And the longer you stayed in the same clothes, because a sniper couldn't afford to change, often the worse it got. Trench foot was another nightmare. Standing in wet boots all day caused the skin to rot off your feet. Some soldiers' toes literally fell off. And as a sniper, you couldn't exactly go on medical leave. If you were lucky, a comrade would wrap your wounds in rags and send you back out. It's cool isolation, even among comrades. Though you were technically part of a unit, snipers were isolated. Regular infantry saw them as a different breed, quiet, cold, almost inhuman. They didn't socialize much. They didn't laugh around the campfire, because when your job is to stare through a scope and end lives one by one, it changes you. Other soldiers respected snipers, but they also feared them. They knew snipers lived closer to death than anyone else, and sometimes that fear turned into resentment. If a German counter-sniper started targeting the unit, guess who they blamed? The Soviet sniper who had drawn attention by picking off high-value targets. So you weren't really part of the team. You were alone. Even when you were surrounded by people, you felt like you were on a different planet. Propaganda versus reality. Of course, Soviet propaganda painted a different picture. They showed smiling snipers in crisp uniforms, shaking hands with generals after another heroic day on the front. They told stories of legendary warriors like Ludmila Pavlichenko, nicknamed Lady Death, who racked up over 300 kills. But what they didn't tell you was how Pavlichenko had to spend hours lying motionless in mud, covered in bugs, waiting for a single clean shot. They didn't mention how she was wounded multiple times by shrapnel, or how she probably never slept without hearing the echoes of the men she killed. Propaganda told you that being a sniper was glorious. Reality told you it was survival at its most brutal. The mental toll before the kill. So all of this, the cold, the hunger, the disease, the isolation, it wasn't just physical. It ate away at your mind before you ever pulled the trigger. Imagine lying in total silence for 10 hours straight. You can't cough, you can't stretch, you can barely breathe. Your thoughts wander. You start thinking about home, about family. Then you remember they might already be dead, or starving, or worse, taken by the enemy. You wonder if today is your last day. You know the German sniper is out there, watching. You're hunting him, but he's hunting you, too. Every second you're alive feels borrowed. And this wasn't even combat yet. Okay. This was just existing as a Soviet sniper. Before you fired a single bullet, you were already half dead from exhaustion, hunger, cold, and fear. And you hadn't even started the real game. The duel between hunters. Harsh training and relentless selection. Before a Soviet sniper ever touched the front lines, they first had to survive something almost as brutal. Training. The Soviet Union didn't hand out sniper rifles to anyone who fancied themselves a good shot. Okay? No, this was a role reserved for the calmest, toughest, and most unyielding soldiers. Okay? And the way they chose you, it wasn't by asking politely. Okay? It was by breaking you, who became a sniper. Okay? First, you have to understand why someone ended up in sniper school. Sometimes, you were selected because you had sharp eyesight. Maybe your commanding officer saw you shoot a rifle once and thought you had promise. Or maybe, in civilian life, you were a hunter or worked in forestry. You knew how to track animals, how to move silently, how to wait. Those skills translated into the sniper world, but often it wasn't even your choice. The Red Army might simply point at you and say, "You're going to be a sniper now." And if you refused, well, let's just say, refusal wasn't an option in Stalin's army. The first days of training. From day one, the instructors wanted to see if you would break. There was no gentle introduction. They started by taking away your comfort's food, sleep, and warmth. You might be forced to crawl for hours through icy mud just to reach a designated firing spot. Then, after you were soaked and shivering, they'd make you lie completely still for hours more, rifle aimed, waiting for a signal that might never come. Why? Because this was sniper reality. If you couldn't stay motionless for long stretches, you wouldn't survive the front. The instructors would yell, "A sniper who moves is a dead sniper," and they meant it. If you twitched, even to scratch an itch, you were punished. The art of camouflage. One of the most grueling parts of sniper training was camouflage. You didn't just throw on a white sheet in the snow and call it a day, okay? No, you had to become invisible. Instructors taught you how to blend into any terrain. Snow, rubble, forest, swamp. You smeared mud on your face. You collected leaves and branches to build a personal ghillie suit. You learned how to use dead bodies and debris as cover, even lying directly on top of them to mask your silhouette. Then came the worst part. The instructors would actively hunt you. They'd tell you, "Go hide in this area. We'll give you 10 minutes. Then they'd bring in other soldiers with binoculars and dogs to try to find you. They spotted you even. a hint of movement, you failed. Some recruits hid so well, they weren't found even after hours. Others, they couldn't last 10 minutes. Those were the ones sent back to the regular infantry, where their life expectancy dropped 2 weeks. Firing drills under pressure. Of course, shooting was at the core of everything. But it wasn't just about hitting a target. It was about hitting the right target at the right time. Snipers were trained to fire under the most stressful conditions imaginable. Your instructor might have you lie in freezing water for an hour, then suddenly shout, "Target, 400 meters. 5 seconds." You had to steady your breath, calculate the wind, and take the shot immediately. They'd make you shoot at moving targets, sometimes half hidden, sometimes only appearing for a split second. 'Cause, in the field, you rarely had the luxury of a stationary enemy. They even taught you psychological firing. For example, if you had 2 targets in sight, you didn't just shoot the one in the open. You shot the leader, the officer, the one giving commands. One bullet could break an entire squad's morale. Endurance tests. Perhaps the hardest part wasn't even the shooting. It was the endurance. Trainees were pushed to physical collapse. They had to march 50 kilometers with full gear, then immediately go into stealth mode and take precision shots while their muscles were screaming. Sometimes, instructors forced them to stay awake for 48 hours straight, then ordered them to crawl silently through a mock battlefield. Why? Because a sniper on the front wouldn't have a regular sleep schedule. It'd be called to action at any hour, often after long periods of waiting, okay? And if you nodded off on the battlefield, you didn't wake up. It's mental fortitude, the true test. But physical toughness was only half the equation. The true battlefield for a sniper was in the mind. In training, you were reminded constantly, you are not a soldier. You are a hunter. You are death itself. Instructors drilled into you that hesitation was unacceptable. If you saw the target, you fired without thinking about who they were, without wondering if they had a family, while considering whether they were just a scared teenager like you. One exercise was particularly chilling. They'd bring in captured enemy soldiers, prisoners of war. So they'd line them up, then tell sniper trainees to pick one and aim. Some trainees hesitated, horrified, and those who hesitated, they were pulled from sniper training immediately, because on the front, hesitation meant you died instead. Psychological tricks. Sniper school also taught mind games. You learned how to make yourself seem like you weren't there. For example, after firing, you didn't run. You stayed put, because enemy soldiers would often fire blindly at the spot where they thought the shot came from. You had to resist the primal urge to move. You were taught how to bait enemy snipers. Maybe you'd put a helmet on a stick, raise it above cover, and wait for the enemy sniper to fire. The moment they revealed their position, that's when you took your shot. These weren't just technical lessons. They were lessons in patience, deception, and cold-blooded calculation. Failure meant death. And here, that's the thing. Failure in sniper training didn't just mean you got a bad grade. If you failed, you were sent back to the regular infantry, okay? And on the Eastern Front, regular infantry was cannon fodder. Entire platoons were wiped out in single assaults. So, every recruit in sniper school knew the stakes. Either you became a hunter, or you became the hunted. The emotional cost of becoming ready. By the end of training, the person who walked out was not the same person who walked in. Snipers learned to slow their heartbeat. They learned to suppress their emotions. They learned to detach from the act of killing. One Soviet instructor was quoted saying, "We don't teach you to shoot. We teach you to stop caring about what you're shooting at." You weren't just trained to hit a target. You were trained to erase your humanity when necessary. A rare glimpse of success. Only a handful of trainees made it through. And those who did were hailed as elite. They were given scoped rifles, extra rations, sometimes even small privileges. They were praised in propaganda newspapers. But here's the dark irony. All that training didn't make you invincible. It only made you a prime target. The moment you killed your first German officer, the enemy started hunting you. So success in sniper school was just step 1. Step 2 was staying alive long enough to use what you learned. In classroom to hell. Graduation wasn't a celebration. There were no ceremonies, no applause. You simply received your rifle and orders. Frontline, Stalingrad, Leningrad, Kursk, and that was it. You were thrown into the same frozen hellscape as everyone else. But unlike a regular soldier, you didn't fight in a squad. You operated alone or with one spotter. So the moment you left sniper school, you stepped into a life where every second was a duel with death. And this was just training. It didn't prepare you for the feeling of lying in ruins for 18 hours, knowing another sniper was out there aiming at you. It didn't prepare you for the eyes of the first man you killed. It didn't prepare you for the psychological decay that came later, because training might have turned you into a weapon, okay, but it couldn't save you from the nightmares. Sniper life in the ruins, a morbid routine. So you've survived sniper school. You've been handed your rifle, most likely a Mosin-Nagant 9130s with a Pu-scope, a weapon as crude and cold as the war itself. You've been told you're now part of the elite. But the moment you arrive at the front, reality slaps you in the face. Because being a Soviet sniper in World War II wasn't a glamorous, heroic image painted in propaganda posters. It was a slow-motion nightmare repeated day after day, with no guarantee you'd see another sunrise. Waking up in the graveyard of cities. Most Soviet snipers were deployed in shattered cities like Stalingrad, where the ruins stretched for miles. There was no front line in a city like that. Every building, every pile of rubble, every sewer tunnel was contested ground. Your day began before dawn. In whatever hideout you had slept in Nif, you even managed to sleep. Maybe it was an abandoned factory basement. Maybe the upper floor of a half-collapsed apartment building. Sometimes you slept next to corpses because the ruins were too full of death to find a clean spot. You didn't eat much. A piece of black bread, maybe some dried fish, washed down with bitter tea, if you were lucky enough to have rations that day. You didn't speak. Words were wasted energy. And then you'd crawl out into the frozen rubble and begin another day of hunting, finding the perfect nest. The first rule of a sniper was, never stay in the same place twice. You had to find a new firing position every day. It's a collapsed attic, a burned-out tram car, a sewer manhole. You used anything you could find, but it wasn't just about hiding. It was about seeing without being seen. A good sniper nest gave you a view of enemy movement. Maybe a street where German soldiers carried supplies. Maybe the entrance to a command post. Maybe an open square where officers liked to give orders. But if you chose wrong, you picked a spot that had already been compromised or was too exposed. You were dead before you fired a single shot. So you spent hours scouting, crawling on your belly like a snake, studying angles and shadows. Sometimes you moved only a few centimeters per minute, terrified the glint of your scope would give you away, the stillness that drove men mad. Once you settled into your nest, the real torture began. You could not move at all. Imagine lying on freezing concrete for 10, 12, even 18 hours straight, unable to stretch your legs, unable to shift your weight. If you sneezed, you could die. If you scratched your nose, you could die. If you twitched when an insect crawled across your face, you could die. Your entire body screamed in agony from the stillness, but you had to remain as cold and lifeless as the rubble around you. Some snipers developed a technique. They would slow their breathing until their heart rate dropped, almost like meditation. But others cracked, okay? They panicked, they moved, and within seconds, they were spotted by German lookouts, or worse, an enemy sniper. The stillness was more than physical. It was mental. You had to sit in the quiet and listen to your own thoughts, which grew darker with every passing hour, watching the enemy. From your nest, you became a silent witness to the enemy's routine. You watched German soldiers laughing as they smoked cigarettes. You saw them eating, reading letters from home, sharing jokes. Sometimes you saw medics treating the wounded. Sometimes you saw teenagers, just boys, really carrying rifles that looked too big for them. And your orders were simple. Kill. Didn't matter if they looked young. Didn't matter if they were just standing guard. If they wore the gray-green uniform, they were a target. But you didn't just fire blindly. A sniper's bullet was precious. You had to wait for the right target. Maybe an officer with a map under his arm. Maybe a machine gunner setting up a nest. Maybe a soldier carrying extra ammunition to the front line. You watched, you waited, you aimed. The moment of the shot. When you finally decided to take the shot, your entire world shrank to the crosshairs of your scope. Your breathing slowed, your finger tightened on the trigger, and then crack, a single shot. For a brief second, there was silence. Then the chaos began. The enemy would shout. They'd scramble for cover. Sometimes they'd fire wildly in your direction, bullets hitting everything but you. Sometimes they'd freeze in terror, unsure where the shot came from, but you didn't stay to watch. A good sniper never fired more than 2 or 3 times from the same nest, because the moment you fired, the clock started ticking. Enemy snipers would start scanning. Mortar crews would start aiming, so you disappeared like a ghost, being hunted in return. And here's the dark truth. Every time you killed, the enemy took it personally. German snipers were trained specifically to hunt Soviet snipers. They watched for the faintest sign of movement. They baited you with decoys. They learned your patterns, so it became a deadly game of chess between 2 invisible killers. It's meat. Sometimes you knew you were being hunted, but you could feel the enemy sniper watching you. You didn't know where he was, but you knew he was out there waiting for you to make a mistake. And when snipers dueled, there was no warning. One of you would die instantly without ever knowing who won the duel. The constant fear of the scope glint. Even the tiniest mistake could reveal you. The sun hitting your rifle scope could give you away. So could a reflection from your binoculars. Even the puff of breath from your mouth in the winter air could betray your position. Soviet snipers learned to smear mud or soot on their scope to dull any shine. They held their breath when the light shifted. They draped torn rags over their rifles to break up the outline. But no matter how careful you were, you lived with the constant fear that someone, somewhere, had already seen you. The loneliness of the job. Like regular soldiers, snipers rarely fought in groups. Sometimes you worked with a spotter or partner who helped you identify targets and watch your back. But often, you were completely alone. You couldn't talk. You couldn't make noise. You couldn't even move freely. You just existed, alone with your thoughts, your rifle, and the endless weight of silence. Some snipers wrote in their diaries later that they started talking to themselves just to feel human. Others said they imagined conversations with the people they were about to kill, wondering who they were, what their lives had been like before the war. And every time you took a life, the loneliness grew heavier, rotting in the rubble. Living conditions for snipers were beyond miserable. You couldn't light fires because smoke would reveal your position. You couldn't bathe. You couldn't even remove your boots for days at a time because you might need to move at any moment. Your uniform became stiff with dirt and sweat. Lice and fleas were constant companions. You smelled like the ruins you lived in. Sometimes you ate the same frozen bread ration for 3 days. Sometimes you went without food entirely. Water came from melted snow or puddles in bomb craters. And sleep. Forget it. You snatched minutes at a time, if you were lucky. The psychological toll. It wasn't the physical hardship that broke most snipers. It was the mental weight. You weren't just killing soldiers, okay? You were killing them up close, watching the exact moment their body collapsed, seeing the life leave their eyes. Some soldiers could detach. They told themselves, it's war. It's necessary. But for others, the guilt was like poison. You started dreaming about the faces of the men you killed. You started wondering if they had children. You started seeing them when you closed your eyes at night. There are recorded accounts of Soviet snipers who eventually turned their rifles on themselves, unable to bear the weight of their kills. Strange kind of fame. Ironically, the better you were at your job, the more dangerous your life became. If you killed enough Germans, your name might make it into Soviet newspapers. You'd be called a hero of the Soviet Union. Your confirmed kills listed like a badge of honor. But that fame had a price. Once the Germans knew your name, they wanted you dead even more. Elite German snipers would be specifically sent to track you down. So every time you made a successful kill, you became more of a target. No safe place, no relief. The worst part, There was no end to the day. Even when you crawled back to your hideout, you weren't safe. Artillery could hit at any moment. A counter-sniper could be waiting to ambush you. You never truly relaxed. You lived in a constant state of tension. Your nerves wound so tight that even in rare moments of quiet, you jumped at every sound. And tomorrow, it would start all over again. The morbid routine. Wake up in the ruins. Crawl through the rubble. Find a new nest. Lie in stillness. Wait. Kill. Move. Hide. Repeat. That was the life of a Soviet sniper. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't glorious. It was suffocating. You lived like a ghost, half dead yourself, trapped between survival and insanity. And this was only the daily routine, because beyond the day-to-day grind, there were moments of pure horror missions, so suicidal, so gut-wrenching, that even hardened snipers questioned if they'd survive. And that's where we'll go next. Suicide missions and the most dangerous orders. By now, you've endured the grinding, soul-crushing routine of a Soviet sniper. The hunger, the loneliness, the silent duels in the rubble. But sometimes, the war demanded even more from you. It wasn't enough to lie in wait, picking off targets at a distance. Sometimes you were given orders that were so dangerous, so close to guaranteed death, they weren't even missions, they were suicide assignments. The day the orders came. Usually, it started with a political officer or a superior trudging through the ruins to find you. His expression would already tell you everything. There was no small talk, just a few clipped words. You're being reassigned. Special duty. You didn't ask questions. You didn't argue. You couldn't. In the Red Army, refusing an order wasn't an option. Refusal meant you'd be shot as a coward or deserter. And sometimes, it wasn't just youth. They'd punish your family back home too, so you followed. Special duty. What it really meant. What did special duty mean for a Soviet sniper? Sometimes it was a high-value assassination, a German officer deep behind enemy lines. Sometimes it was a recon mission, crawling through no man's land to gather intel. And sometimes it was even worse. Bait duty. Bait duty meant deliberately exposing yourself to lure out an enemy sniper, so your comrades could spot his location. You were essentially being offered up like a lamb to the slaughter. They dressed it up as heroism, but you knew the truth. It was suicide with a fancy name, crawling into the heart of the enemy. Imagine being told to cross the front lines alone at night. You'd carry just your rifle, a few cartridges, and maybe a knife. No food, no backup, no radio. You'd crawl for hours through the frozen mud, past dead soldiers, past barbed wire, past mines and booby traps. Sometimes you could hear the Germans talking just meters away. One wrong sound, one misstep, one glint of moonlight on your scope hand, you were finished. The whole time you had one thought looping in your mind. Why me? Why did they choose me for this? But you knew why. You were a sniper. You were expendable, but skilled enough that they thought you might survive. The decapitation missions. One of the most common suicide missions was to take out enemy officers. Hey, sounds simple in theory. Wait for an officer to appear, then shoot him. But in reality, officers rarely exposed themselves. They were surrounded by bodyguards, hidden in bunkers, or constantly on the move. To get a shot, you had to crawl deep into enemy territories, sometimes spending days behind their lines. You couldn't just kill any random officer. No, the political officers wanted specific targets. A company commander known for rallying his men, a machine gun officer pinning down Soviet troops, or even a decorated German sniper who'd been terrorizing the Red Army. If you succeeded, you might turn the tide of a local battle. If you failed, well, you'd just be one more nameless corpse in the ruins, bait for the enemy. Then there were the truly cruel orders, to act as bait. Here's how it worked. The Germans had an elite sniper causing havoc. No one could find him. The only way to draw him out was to give him a tempting target. So they picked you. Your job was to deliberately make yourself visible, just enough to attract the enemy sniper's attention. Maybe you poked your helmet out of a window. Maybe you slowly crawled across a ruined street. You were told to be careful, but everyone knew the truth. You were gambling your life. The German sniper fired. Maybe your comrades would see the muzzle flash and finally locate him. There was no guarantee you'd survive that first shot. Many snipers died as bait, and even if you lived, you never forgot the cold feeling of knowing your life had been used like a piece on a chessboard, killing the ghosts. Some missions weren't even about officers, they were about killing other snipers. The Germans had their own legends, sharpshooters who could put a bullet through a coin from 300 meters, men like Matthias Hetzenauer or Joseph Allerberger, who stalked the battlefield like ghosts. When one of these elite German snipers started racking up kills, Soviet commanders would send you to deal with him. It was sniper versus sniper, hunters, two predators, both invisible. Sometimes these duels lasted days. You'd both lie in silence, watching, waiting, knowing that whoever moved first would probably die. When the shot finally came, it was over in a second. Either you won or you never saw it coming. Crossing the frozen rivers. Another type of suicide mission was wrecking across the rivers. The Volga, the Don, the Dnieper. High in winter, these rivers turned into open killing fields. Commanders would order snipers to cross at night, slipping through the ice to observe enemy fortifications on the far bank. You had to move silently, in total darkness, carrying your rifle above the freezing water. The ice could crack under your weight. German flares could light up the night sky at any moment. If you slipped, the cold would paralyze you in seconds. And even if you made it across, you were alone on the enemy side, surrounded by patrols. It wasn't bravery that got you through these missions. It was sheer, stubborn survival instinct. When the enemy turned the tables. Sometimes suicide missions weren't planned, they just happened. You'd go out on what seemed like a normal operation, and suddenly the situation flipped. Maybe the Germans had anticipated your move. Maybe they'd laid a trap. Maybe they had their own sniper team waiting. One moment, you were the hunter. The next, you were surrounded. And the Germans didn't always kill captured snipers. Sometimes they used you as bait against your own comrades. They'd force you to call out in Russian, pretending to be wounded, luring others into a trap. You knew if you were caught, there was no mercy. Both sides despised enemy snipers. Captured snipers were often tortured before being executed, so you fought like a cornered animal to avoid capture. 'Cause, for a sniper, dying in battle was a cleaner death than what awaited in enemy hands. Political missions, killing under orders. Not all suicide missions were military. Some were political. There were times when the Communist Party wanted a statement kill to inspire propaganda. You'd be ordered to take out a specific German soldier in a highly visible way, just so Soviet newspapers could report it as a great victory. The mission didn't matter if it made strategic sense. It mattered that it looked heroic. And if you failed, you weren't just in danger from the enemy. Your own political officers might execute you for cowardice. That was the paradox of being a Soviet sniper. You were caught between two firing squads, one German, one Soviet. The snipers who never came back. There are countless Soviet sniper records with the chilling footnote, "Did not return from mission." Those words covered so many fates. Some were shot by enemy snipers. Some froze to death in no man's land. Some stepped on mines. Some were captured, tortured, and killed. And some simply vanished, their bodies never found, their names lost to time. Even the most famous snipers weren't safe. Ludmila Pavlichenko, the legendary female sniper with over 300 confirmed kills, was eventually pulled off the front because the risk to her life became too great. Others, like Vasily Zaitsev, survived only by sheer luck and skill. But for every Zaitsev, there were hundreds of nameless snipers who went on suicide missions and never came back. The worst part? Knowing it was pointless. What broke many snipers wasn't just the danger. It was the creeping realization that some of these missions didn't even matter. You risked your life to kill one officer, only for another to take his place. You crossed enemy lines to gather intel, only for the front to shift a week later. Sometimes you sacrificed everything for a mission that made no real difference in the grand scale of the war. And you wondered, was this worth it? Was my life worth this one bullet? Like the unspoken truth among snipers? Okay. When snipers met between missions, they didn't talk about the kills. They didn't boast. Okay. Instead, they shared quiet looks because they all understood the same truth. Being a sniper wasn't glorious. It was living on borrowed time. Every mission could be your last. And sometimes you knew it would be your last, but you still went because the alternative was worse. Why'd they still went? So why did they go? Some went out of duty, some out of fear of their own commanders. Some went because they believed in the motherland, and some went simply because they had no choice. In the Soviet army, you didn't get to decide whether you wanted to live or die. So you gritted your teeth, loaded your rifle, and walked into hell, surviving a suicide mission. On the rare occasions you survived a suicide mission, you didn't feel like a hero, a Tia. You felt hollow. You came back filthy, starving, shaking from exhaustion. Your comrades might cheer. The officers might shake your hand. The political officers might write your name in the newspaper. But deep down, you knew you'd only survived by luck. And you knew the next mission might be the one that finally ended you. That was the reality of suicide missions for Soviet snipers' missions, where bravery and futility were one and the same. But even if you survived the missions, even if you made it through the worst days of the war, there was one more thing that made you regret ever picking up that rifle. 'Cause surviving the war didn't mean the nightmare was over. When survival wasn't the end. Life after the rifle. Surviving the front didn't mean you were free. It didn't mean peace. It didn't mean rest. It didn't even mean you were safe. Because for a Soviet sniper, surviving the war was only the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. If you might, VA thought, making it out alive meant you'd get to return home as a hero. That you'd finally escape the endless cold, the fear, the crawling through rubble with death in your shadow. But the truth, the war followed you home, coming back to nothing. If you were lucky enough to survive your countless missions, one day you'd be told your unit was being rotated out. Maybe you were injured. Maybe you'd finally served long enough. And just like that, they'd hand you discharge papers and send you back. Back to what? You stepped off the train into a country that hardly existed anymore. Whole towns were burned to the ground. Cities were nothing but skeletons of stone. Families were scattered. You'd walk the streets and realize there was no home waiting for you. Your house might have been destroyed. Your parents or siblings might have been killed, deported, or simply vanished in the chaos. So you came back from hell to find there was nothing left to come back to. The eyes of a killer. Even if you did find surviving family, you were no longer the same person they remembered. Your hands trembled when you held a cup. You flinched at loud noises. Your sleep was haunted by every face you'd seen through your scope. Okay, when you looked in the mirror, you didn't see the same eyes you'd left with. There was a saying among snipers, okay, you can wash the blood from your hands, but never from your soul. And it was true. You could never unsee the man you killed. You could never unhear the cries of soldiers dying in the snow. You could never forget the feeling of watching life vanish through your crosshairs. So, even though you were home, the war lived inside you, not a hero or suspect. And here was the cruelest twist of all. You might have expected to be welcomed as a hero. After all, you'd risked your life for the motherland. You'd done everything the party asked of you. But in Stalin's Soviet Union, surviving too long made you suspicious. Political officers sometimes viewed war survivors, especially elite soldiers, like snipers, with paranoia. Why had you survived when so many others died? Did you make deals with the enemy? Did you abandon your comrades? Did you secretly harbor anti-Soviet thoughts? Even the act of being captured by Germans, even for a single day, could mark you as tainted. You might be interrogated, sent to a labor camp, or even executed just for surviving in the wrong way. Some snipers returned home only to be arrested as possible traitors. Their reward for fighting the war was a cell in the Gulag, forgotten by the state. And even if you weren't arrested, you were often forgotten. The Soviet Union loved to glorify the idea of a sniper. Propaganda posters showed fearless sharpshooters defending the motherland. Newspapers printed heroic tales of Vasily Zaitsev or Ludmila Pavlichenko, but the real snipers, the ones who weren't famous, they faded into obscurity. No parades, no medals, no help adjusting back to civilian life. Many of them ended up working low-paying jobs, living in silence, hiding their past. No one wanted to hear their stories. No one wanted to remember the reality of what they'd done. Haunted nights. At night, it all came back. You lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, hearing the same sounds from the battlefield, the echo of a rifle shot, the distant scream of a wounded man, the crunch of boots in the snow as you crawled toward your next target. You'd close your eyes and see faces, dozens, hundreds of faces. Some of them you'd killed. Some of them were your comrades who died beside you. Sleep didn't bring peace. It brought replays. Some snipers turned to vodka, drinking themselves into numbness. Others withdrew completely, isolating themselves because they couldn't relate to anyone anymore. What could you tell a civilian out? Could you explain what it felt like to kill so many? You couldn't, so you kept it inside until it ate you alive. The weight of every shot. Being a sniper wasn't like being an artilleryman or an infantry soldier. When you pulled the trigger, you knew exactly who you were killing. You saw their eyes. You watched the moment life left their body. It wasn't an impersonal explosion from a distance. It was intimate, personal, and even if you told yourself it was for the motherland, that it was necessary, a part of you still wondered. What was his name? Did he have a family? Was he just like me, another young man who didn't choose this war? That doubt stayed with you. It grew louder in the silence of peacetime. Enemies in peacetime. Even after the war ended, you weren't really free of enemies. Some former comrades envied or resented you. Others feared you because they knew what you were capable of. In some towns, returning snipers were treated with a kind of wary distance. You were the person who'd spent years hunting and killing in silence. You were different, Ken, in a country full of informants and secret police. Any rumor about you could ruin your life. One careless word, someone accusing you of spying or sympathizing with the enemy, and everything you survived would mean nothing. A lost generation. The war created an entire generation of broken men and women. Some tried to start families. Some succeeded, building quiet lives, never speaking of what they'd done. Others couldn't. They were too damaged, too lost in their own memories. And some simply disappeared. Veterans who couldn't handle peacetime would wander off, drinking themselves to death or vanishing into the wilderness. The government didn't care. There was always another war, another generation of soldiers to use. The irony of fame. For the few who did become famous, like Pavlichenko, was out of life, wasn't easy either. They were paraded around for propaganda, interviewed, photographed, sent to foreign tours. But fame didn't erase the trauma. Ludmila Pavlichenko, despite her legendary status, suffered severe depression after the war. Zaitsev lived quietly, avoiding the spotlight because he didn't want to relive the memories. And fame made you a target. Resentment, jealousy, political scrutiny. So even being celebrated wasn't freedom. It was just a different kind of cage, living in the shadows. So, what became of the average Soviet sniper? Most lived out their days in silence. Some wrote memoirs, only to have them censored or rewritten by the state. Others never spoke a word about the war again. They avoided questions. They avoided crowds. They became shadows in their own country. And yet, inside, they carried an invisible weight heavier than any metal. The war never ends. This was the cruelest part of all. You thought the war would end when the gunfire stopped. But for a sniper, the war never really ends. It stays with you in your mind, in your dreams, in the way your hands tremble when you hear a sudden noise. It stays in the silence when you're alone, staring at the same rifle that once saved your life and stole so many others. And it stays in the regret, not just for the people you killed, but for the part of yourself you lost with every single shot. Why survival felt like a curse. So you survived. But sometimes survival felt worse than death, because death was final, simple. Survival meant living with the ghosts, living with the memories, living in a world that didn't care what you'd been through. And every morning when you woke up, you'd wonder, why did I survive when so many didn't? Was it worth it? There was no answer, only silence. For a Soviet sniper, surviving the war wasn't victory. It was just another kind of battle, one you fought alone for the rest of your life. The mental chess game. Facing the best of the German snipers, it wasn't just war. It wasn't just survival. For a Soviet sniper, every mission was a game of shadows, silent, deadly chess match where one wrong move meant instant death. Because you weren't the only one hunting, they were hunting you too. And on the other side of no man's land were the best German marksman men, trained to the same razor-sharp precision, men who lived for the same deadly purpose. It was sniper versus sniper, patience versus patience, nerves of steel against nerves of steel, and only one could leave the battlefield alive. The invisible duel. Most soldiers faced death in loud, chaotic waves, machine guns, artillery, bayonet charges, but for snipers, death was quiet. It came from nowhere. You could crawl into a perfect position, set up your rifle, think you were the hunter only to feel that sudden, searing pain in your head or chest. Because while you were aiming, someone else was aiming at you. That's what made facing German snipers so terrifying. You never saw them, never heard them. They could wait for days, just like you, motionless in the mud. They could watch you through their scope, breathing softly, waiting for the smallest mistake, an elbow poking out of cover, a tiny flicker of movement, the glint of sunlight on your scope, and then, click, gone. No warning, no chance to run. It was a game where one blink could end your life. German snipers, deadly rivals. The Wehrmacht didn't underestimate the Soviet snipers. They had their own elite marksmen, many hardened by years of training and combat in places like France and Poland before ever reaching the Eastern Front. Men like Matthews, Hitzenauer, Joseph Allerberger, and Friedrich Pien were considered artists of death. They carried precision rifles, Mausers, fitted with high-quality optics. They understood camouflage as well as you did. They could sit still for hours, even days, blending into rubble, snow, or forest, and they were just as motivated. To them, you weren't a person. You were a target, a number, an obstacle to be eliminated. Facing them wasn't like hunting regular soldiers. This was predator versus predator, the cat-and-mouse stalemate. Sometimes you'd know exactly where the German sniper was hiding, but you couldn't see him. You'd wait. He'd wait. Hours passed, then a day, then another. Neither of you moved. Neither of you fired, because whoever fired first risked revealing their position. Whoever got impatient would die, so it became a brutal test of patience. Could you lie perfectly still for 30 hours, in freezing temperatures, with no food, no water, barely breathing? Could you resist the urge to shift when your muscles cramped and your skin went numb? Some couldn't, and the second they twitched, they were gone. That was the reality of sniper duels. Not just skill, but endurance. The psychological torture. It wasn't just about who was faster with a rifle. It was a mental war, 'cause every time you moved into position, you felt this invisible weight pressing down on you. Is someone watching me right now? Is there a scope aimed at my head? You didn't know, so you second-guessed everything. Should you peek out from behind that wall? Should you crawl another inch forward? Should you take the shot now, or wait? Even a single heartbeat of hesitation could cost your life. And every time you escaped, every time you didn't get shot, it only made the fear worse, because you knew it wasn't luck, it was just not your turn yet. Bait and traps. The Germans were clever. They'd use decoys, helmets on sticks, mannequins, or even the bodies of dead soldiers, propped up to lure out Soviet snipers. If you fired at the decoy, you exposed yourself. And the real sniper, hidden somewhere deeper, would take you out immediately. You learned not to trust easy shots. Times you wanted to shoot, but you hesitated, because what if it was a trick? So it became a game of layers. You knew they were setting traps. They knew you knew. So they'd set double traps, or leave real soldiers as bait. And you had to read it all like a puzzle, under the constant threat of death. Learning to think like the enemy. To survive, you had to get inside the German sniper's mind. Where would he hide? How would he move? What would he expect you to do? You had to predict his next move, like a chess master, 3 steps ahead. Sometimes you'd even set your own traps, leave your position exposed on purpose, making it look like you'd made a mistake. Then, when the German sniper took the bait, you'd fire first, but that meant trusting your instincts completely. One wrong calculation, and it was over. It's the famous duels. The most legendary sniper duels became almost mythic. Take Vasily Zaitsev, the Soviet marksman who hunted down the German ace known as Major Erwin Gig in Stalingrad. For days, they stalked each other through the ruined city. Gig was rumored to be an elite instructor sent specifically to kill Zaitsev, and became a deadly game of deception. Zaitsev and his spotter, Nikolai Kulikov, crawled silently through rubble, using mirrors and scraps of metal to draw Koenig's fire and reveal his position. In the end, Zaitsev outsmarted him, waiting patiently, timing his shot perfectly, and killing Koenig with a single bullet. But here's the thing, okay? That duel might have been famous, but it wasn't unique. Dozens, maybe hundreds of sniper duels played out like this across the Eastern Front, silent battles no one ever recorded. And for every sniper who survived one, there was another who didn't, when nature turned against you. As if the enemy wasn't enough, the environment could kill you too. Hours of lying in freezing snow led to frostbite. Sitting motionless in wet clothes caused hypothermia. Your stomach cramped from hunger. Your bladder ached because you couldn't move to relieve yourself. Sometimes insects or rats crawled over your body while you were forced to stay still. Mosquitoes bit your face, and you couldn't swat them away. Even the weather betrayed you. Wind could shift your shot by a few centimeters, enough to miss your target and reveal your location. So you weren't just fighting the enemy, you were fighting your own body and the elements. One shot, one chance. When the moment finally came, the one instant where you had a clear view of the enemy sniper, you had one shot. One. If you missed, you'd never get another. Because the second your rifle fired, you exposed yourself. The enemy would either move instantly or fire back. So your finger hovered over the trigger. Your breathing slowed to almost nothing. Your mind emptied of everything but that single point in your scope. And then, in one fluid motion crack, silence. Either you lived or you didn't. The fear of being hunted. What made it worse was knowing the German snipers were just as good as you. They were trained, disciplined, and patient. They respected the same deadly craft. So when you crawled into position, you always felt it that cold. It's a creeping feeling that someone else was already there, already watching you, okay? And sometimes you were being hunted without even knowing. Aftermath of a duel. If you won, you felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief, because you were still alive. Dread, because you had just ended another life, someone who, just like you, had been lying in the dirt, hungry, tired, scared. It was like looking in a mirror and pulling the trigger on yourself. And the worst part, you knew it would happen again, tomorrow, the next day, until eventually your luck would run out. Living on the razor's edge, every sniper duel chipped away at your sanity. The endless waiting, the silent tension, the knowledge that at any second your brain could explode without warning. It created a kind of hyper-awareness, your senses sharpened beyond normal, but also frayed at the edges. You became a ghost of yourself, operating on instinct and fear, living in a constant state of controlled panic. No glory, only survival. People back home thought sniper duels were glamorous, heroic. But in reality, it was suffocating. There was no glory in staring at a patch of rubble for 18 hours straight. No glory in killing a man you never spoke to, never even truly saw. It wasn't a duel in the romantic sense. It was just another step toward the grave. the endless game. Even when you survived one duel, you knew there would be another. Somewhere out there, another German sniper was waiting, set. Another invisible set of eyes was peering through a scope, searching for you. The game never ended. It just moved to a new battlefield, okay? And deep down, you knew that one day you'd lose. Because no sniper survived forever. In the world of Soviet snipers, every shot was a gamble. Every mission was a silent dance with death. And when you faced the best of the German marksmen, it wasn't just about who had the better rifle. It was about who could endure the madness of waiting, who could stay calm when their heartbeat sounded like a drum in their ears, who could outthink an enemy who was just like them. It was a mental chess game with the highest possible stakes. One move, one mistake, game over. The crushing discipline, why snipers couldn't afford to be human being. A Soviet sniper in World War II wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about becoming something less than human, because the Red Army didn't want you to feel. It didn't want you to hesitate. It didn't want you to think of your target as a living person. It wanted you to be a weapon, a tool. And to stay that way, you had to suppress everything: your fear, your doubt, your compassion. The discipline was so relentless, so suffocating, that over time, it didn't just strip away your humanity. It reshaped your soul. The Red Army's unyielding rules, the Soviet high command believed snipers were the ultimate psychological weapon. Every kill you made wasn't just about numbers. It sent terror rippling through enemy lines. A single sniper could paralyze an entire sector, force soldiers to hide, slow down movements. So you weren't just expected to be good, you were expected to be perfect. No wasted bullets. Every shot counted. Missing wasn't just a failure, it was a sin. No retreat. If you were sent to hold a position, you stayed there until the mission was done, or you were dead. No fear. If you hesitated, if you disobeyed, you were labeled a coward. And cowards didn't get second chances. There was no mercy for mistakes. And behind every mission was the unspoken knowledge: if the Germans didn't kill you, your own commanders might. NKVD blocking units. Death behind you. It wasn't just the Germans you feared. Behind Soviet front lines lurked the NKVD blocking units, political police tasked with maintaining discipline. Their orders were simple: if a soldier retreats without permission, shoot them. If a soldier surrenders, they're a traitor. If a soldier fails a mission, assume sabotage. So as a sniper, you couldn't run. You couldn't say, "I need rest." You couldn't even admit you were afraid, because the moment you faltered, your own side would turn on you. Imagine crawling into a sniper nest, knowing that if you failed, you wouldn't just face the enemy, you'd face execution from your own comrades. That's the kind of crushing discipline that kept Soviet snipers locked in a state of constant, suffocating tension. The emotional armor. The Soviet sniper doctrine emphasized dehumanizing the enemy. You were trained to see Germans, not as men, but as fascist beasts, as targets, as problems to eliminate. But deep down, you knew they were human. You saw the fear in their eyes through your scope. You saw them talking, laughing, lighting cigarettes. You saw them share bread with their comrades, or sit quietly in the trench, lost in thought. And then you pulled the trigger. Over time, you had to build emotional armor, and numbness that shielded you from the weight of what you were doing. You couldn't afford to think that soldier has a mother waiting for him. You couldn't allow yourself to wonder, what if he's just like me, trapped in this war? Because the second you hesitated, you were dead. So you locked those thoughts away. You buried your humanity under layers of cold detachment. No tears for comrades. The discipline wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about how you dealt with your own side. When your fellow sniper was shot, when your spotter's brains were splattered across the rubble next to you, you couldn't cry, you couldn't scream. You had to stay still, stay focused. Even if the person beside you, your friend, your partner, was bleeding out, you couldn't move to help. Because the second you moved, the German sniper would see you, and you'd die too. So you just watched the life drain out of them silently. Okay. Then, once the danger passed, you dragged their body away and kept going. There was no time for mourning, no time for grief. The Red Army didn't want tears, it wanted results. punishment for weakness. If you cracked under pressure, you missed a target, abandoned a mission, or simply froze in fear, you weren't treated with compassion. You were accused of cowardice. Some snipers who lost their nerve were court-martialed on the spot. Others were sent to penal battalions, frontline suicide squads, where survival was almost impossible. And some were simply shot. The message was clear. If you're not strong enough to be a sniper, you're not strong enough to live. So you learned quickly, no weakness, no complaints, no hesitation. You became what they wanted, a silent, unfeeling machine, living by numbers. To the Soviet command, you weren't a person either. You were a statistic, okay? Every day, you were given a quota. Kill this many enemies, disrupt this many movements, achieve this many confirmed kills. Your worth wasn't measured in bravery or loyalty, it was measured in body counts. And if your numbers dropped, if your efficiency slipped even slightly, suspicion grew. Were you losing your nerve? Were you secretly sympathizing with the enemy? Were you sabotaging the war effort? It didn't matter if the weather was bad or the terrain impossible. Excuses didn't exist. You either met the quota or you paid the price, the silence of the sniper. Unlike regular infantry, you worked alone or with a single spotter. That meant long stretches of silence, days without speaking, days without hearing another human voice except a whisper in your ear. And that silence changed you. When you're alone with your thoughts for that long, in a place where every sound could mean death, your mind starts to twist. You began to hear phantom noises, the imagined scrape of an enemy crawling nearby, the faint click of a rifle bolt that wasn't really there. You questioned reality itself. Was that shadow moving? Or was it just the wind? You couldn't even trust your own senses anymore, okay? And there was no one to talk to, no one to ground you. It's just you, your rifle, and the crushing weight of silence, suppressing the past, the future, the self. Hey, as a sniper, you couldn't think about the past. The faces of the men you killed would haunt you if you let them. You couldn't think about the future either, because deep down, you knew you probably didn't have one. So you stopped thinking of yourself as a person with a life outside the war. You became a ghost in the present moment. Eat, crawl, aim, kill, survive another day. That was it. That was all that remained. The strange comfort of numbness. Eventually, the discipline, the fear, the killing, it all blurred into one endless routine. You stopped feeling the sharp edges of emotion. It's the first time you killed someone, you felt sick. The 10th time, it just felt like work. The 100th time, you barely even noticed. To date, that numbness was what allowed you to keep going. But it was also the most frightening thing of all. Because the more numb you became, the less you recognized yourself. You looked in the mirror and saw someone hollow. Someone who didn't smile, didn't laugh, didn't dream. Someone who had become exactly what the Red Army wanted. A living weapon. It's discipline that never ended. Even off the battlefield, the discipline followed you. Back at camp, there were no warm beds, no real rest. You cleaned your rifle obsessively, studied maps, prepared for the next mission. You didn't get drunk like other soldiers. You didn't relax, because tomorrow you'd be sent out again. And you couldn't afford to let your guard down, not even for a single night. The double-edged metal. And here's the cruelest irony. If you were too good, your kill numbers were extraordinary, you were celebrated. Medals, propaganda posters, your name in the newspapers. But that honor only made life harder, because now the enemy knew who you were. Now they specifically hunted you. You became a marked target, and your own commanders pushed you even harder, expecting you to keep breaking records. There was no escape, no way to slow down. The discipline wasn't just a phase, it was a life sentence until the day you died. Humanity left behind, over weeks, months, years. That discipline did something irreversible. It stripped away your ability to be human. You didn't think about the life you once had before the war. You didn't imagine the life you could have after it. You were trapped in a permanent present of obedience, duty, and death. And even if you somehow survived the war, even if you went home alive, you weren't really the same person anymore. 'Cause how do you go back to being human after being trained to be less than one? This was the crushing reality of Soviet sniper discipline. You weren't just fighting the Germans. You weren't just fighting the weather. You were fighting yourself, fighting to kill the very things that made you feel alive. The Red Army didn't need snipers who felt guilt. It didn't want snipers who questioned their missions. It needed machines in human skin, capable of waiting, watching, and killing without hesitation. And if you couldn't become that, you didn't survive. The silent collapse, when the mind finally breaks. At first, you think you're holding it together. You're surviving. You're following orders. You're hitting your targets. You tell yourself, I'm fine. I'm in control. I'm not like those other soldiers who lose their minds out here. But the truth, nobody survives this war in their head. Not the snipers, not the officers, not the soldiers in the trenches. Eventually, the mind breaks. It's the quietest kind of madness. Snipers had one of the strangest, most dangerous types of warfare. Unlike infantry charges or tank assaults, sniper work was still. You'd sit motionless for hours, even days, crawling inch by inch to a vantage point, holding your breath so the enemy wouldn't hear you, listening so hard for movement that even your heartbeats sounded deafening. It was a kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful. It felt wrong. And in that endless, suffocating silence, your mind started playing tricks on you. You'd imagine footsteps that weren't there. You'd see shadows flicker in the corner of your eye, thinking an enemy was about to strike. Sometimes you swore you heard whispering only to realize it was the wind scraping through the ruins. The isolation chipped away at reality. No, when you did finally move or fire, the sudden violence felt dreamlike, unreal, like it was happening in someone else's life. The haunted scope. Your rifle scope was supposed to give you clarity. You'd scan the battlefield, searching for that one perfect shot. But after weeks, months, years of doing this, the scope became something else entirely. It became a mirror to your own madness. Through it, you watched lives end. The German soldier lighting a cigarette, unaware of your gaze. The officer talking with his men, laughing at a joke. The young recruit who looked too young to even be holding a rifle. And you'd line up to shot. Take a breath, pull the trigger, then watch the spark of life disappear from their eyes in a split second. You saw everything through that little glass circle. And when you closed your eyes later, those faces came back. Not just the ones you killed, but the ones you almost killed. The ones you let live. Sometimes you weren't sure which haunted you more. The dreams that weren't dreams. Sleep was supposed to be your only escape, but it wasn't, because the war followed you there, too. You dream of crawling through rubble, but you couldn't move. You dream of seeing someone in your sights, but when you fired, the bullet turned back toward you. You'd wake up in a cold sweat, unsure if you were still on the battlefield or in the safety of camp. Some snipers stopped sleeping altogether. They'd doze in brief, restless spurts, waking at every tiny sound, clutching their rifle as if it might protect them from their own nightmares. And the worst part, even after the war, the dreams didn't stop. When the faces followed you, they called it the faces. Because once you killed enough people, you stopped seeing them as just soldiers. You remembered their expressions, the confusion, the fear, the split-second realization that they were about to die. And those faces stayed with you. Some veterans later described seeing them, even while awake, brief flashes of someone they killed, standing silently in a doorway or reflected in a window. It wasn't supernatural. It was pure psychological trauma. Your mind just couldn't process the weight of so many deaths, so it kept replaying them, over and over and over, drinking away the voices. Most Soviet snipers didn't talk about their mental state. They couldn't. Admitting you were struggling was seen as weakness, even betrayal. So instead, they turned to the only escape they had, vodka. At night, after missions, they'd drink themselves numb, not to celebrate, not to relax, but to stop thinking, to stop seeing the faces, to stop hearing the phantom footsteps, stop feeling the constant, gnawing dread that tomorrow they'd have to do it all again. But alcohol didn't erase the memories. It just buried them for a while, and when they resurfaced, they came back even worse, hallucinations in the field. As the war dragged on, exhaustion and malnutrition made the mental strain even heavier. Some snipers began hallucinating on missions. They'd see enemy soldiers that weren't really there. They'd aim at phantoms, wasting precious bullets. They'd freeze, unable to tell if the movement in the distance was real or just their mind breaking. And hallucinations were deadly in sniper work. Hesitate for even a second, and you might miss the real enemy who was watching you. Fire at something imaginary, and you revealed your position, signing your own death sentence. The line between sanity and madness was razor thin, and for many, it eventually snapped. Snipers who couldn't pull the trigger. Over time, some snipers simply stopped being able to shoot. The body would betray them. Their hands would shake uncontrollably. Their breathing would get ragged. Their finger would freeze on the trigger. It wasn't fear of dying. It was fear of killing one more person. It seemed too much. Done too much. Their conscience finally rebelled, screaming, "No more." But in the Soviet army, there was no room for that. If you couldn't do your job, you were replaced. And if you refused outright, you were executed for cowardice. Some soldiers forced themselves to keep going, even after their soul had already crumbled. Others quietly wished the enemy sniper would find them first, just to end it all. The strange desire to be shot. It sounds insane, but some snipers began secretly hoping for a bullet, not because they wanted to die in agony, but because a wound, just one bad enough to send you home, was the only way out. If you were shot, you'd be evacuated to a field hospital. And maybe, just maybe, you'd never have to go back to the front lines. So they didn't take as much cover. They didn't crawl as carefully. They put themselves in riskier positions, silently wishing the German sniper would see them. It was a slow, quiet form of suicidal surrender. Survivor's guilt, a key. And if you did survive, if you somehow lived through hundreds of missions, hundreds of kills that didn't leave you, 'cause you went home to find your friends dead, your family bombed, your entire city changed forever. You looked around and realized there was no one left who understood what you'd been through. And in that emptiness, the questions started creeping in. Why did I survive when so many others didn't? Was what I did really worth it? Am I even the same person anymore? You didn't feel like a hero. You just felt tired. The aftermath nobody talks about. After the war, Soviet snipers were sometimes paraded as symbols of national pride. They'd be put on posters in newspapers called heroes of the motherland. But when the parades ended, they were left alone with their memories. No therapy, no understanding, no real help. Most veterans buried their trauma deep inside. Some never spoke of the war again. Some turned into alcoholics, unable to cope with the quiet. Some ended their lives because they couldn't live with what they did nor what they did become. The mental collapse didn't always happen on the battlefield. For many, it came years later in the silence of peacetime, when there was nothing left to distract them from the ghosts. The true cost. So when people talk about the glory of being a sniper, they miss the truth. Yes, you were skilled. You were feared. But the real cost wasn't the risk of death, was the slow death of your own mind. For every day chipped away another piece of who you were. Until one day, you couldn't recognize yourself anymore. And maybe you survived the war, but the war never stopped living inside you. This was the silent collapse, the mental unraveling that no amount of training, discipline, or propaganda could prevent. Because in the end, you weren't a machine. You were human. No human mind can carry that much death without breaking. The deadly rivalry, sniper duels that became death traps. It wasn't just the endless gunfire or the artillery barrages that made the Eastern Front terrifying. For Soviet snipers, the deadliest threat wasn't the tank columns or the machine gun nests. It was someone just like them, another silent hunter, another cold, patient killer. 'Cause if you were a sniper in World War II, you weren't just hunting, you were being hunted. The invisible enemy. When you were sent out on a mission, you didn't always know if the Germans had a sniper waiting, but you felt it. You'd crawl into a ruined factory or a shattered building, scanning for movement. Every glint of light could be a scope. Every shadow could be someone waiting for you to make the first mistake. The enemy sniper was always out there. Sometimes they were watching the exact same window you were looking through. Sometimes they were waiting days just for you to reveal yourself. You didn't know when the shot would come, but you knew it would be silent, sudden, final. The mind games. Sniper duels weren't just about skill. They were psychological warfare. Both shooters were locked in a deadly chess game, trying to outthink and outweight each other. A German sniper might fire deliberately wide not to hit you, but to flush you out. A Soviet sniper might leave a helmet or a dummy in a window, tricking the enemy into revealing their position. They'd use reflections, noises, even wounded soldiers as bait. Sometimes they'd set up false nest spot that looked like it was occupied by a sniper, just to lure the enemy into wasting precious time. Every move was a trap. Every second you stayed still felt like an eternity. And the one who lost patience first lost their life. Days without moving. A duel could last hours or days. Imagine lying in the same exact spot for 36 hours straight. You can't move. You can't sleep. You can't even relieve yourself. You have to stay absolutely still, waiting for a flicker of movement, the faintest sign of your enemy. Your muscles ache. Your skin itches. Your throat burns with thirst. But if you shift even a centimeter, the enemy will see you end. That's the end. Some duels ended with both snipers collapsing from exhaustion before either one took the shot. Others ended with a single, perfect bullet after days of silence. It was a test of not just aim, but willpower. The legend of Zaitsev and Kig. One of the most famous duels of the war was said to have taken place in the ruins of Stalingrad. On one side was Vasily Zaitsev, a Soviet sniper credited with over 200 confirmed kills. On the other, a supposed elite German sniper, sometimes called Major Kig, a sharpshooter brought in specifically to hunt Zaitsev. For days, they played a deadly game of hide-and-seek. Zaitsev scanned every window, every glint of metal. Kig waited, knowing one wrong move would give away his position. In the end, Zaitsev spotted a tiny reflection from Kig's scope, just enough to line up the perfect shot. One trigger pull, and the duel was over. Historians debate whether Kig even existed, or if the story was Soviet propaganda. The idea of that dual image of two snipers locked in a silent battle of nerves became legendary. When a single mistake killed entire units. Here's what made sniper duels even deadlier. It wasn't just your life on the line. If you lost, the enemy sniper was now free to target your comrades. One bad decision, one flash of impatience meant German sharpshooters could start picking off Soviet officers, radio operators, medics. So, when you faced an enemy sniper, it wasn't just a personal fight. It was life or death for everyone around you. That pressure made duels even more intense. You weren't just protecting yourself, you were protecting your entire unit. The cat and mouse of Stalingrad. In Stalingrad, sniper duels reached another level. The city was a labyrinth of rubble, shadows, and broken buildings. Every pile of debris could hide a shooter. Every bombed-out wall created new firing lanes. Snipers would study the ruins for days, memorizing angles, sunlight patterns, and likely enemy positions. They'd set traps with tripwires or planted mines to limit the opponent's movement. Some even fired at different times of day to confuse the enemy about their routine. It was urban warfare taken to an extreme endless game of cat and mouse, where both hunters were also prey. The tension of the scope. The most chilling part of a sniper duel was the moment when you finally saw your opponent through the scope. Your heart would hammer in your chest, 'cause you know right now he might be looking back at you through his scope too. Whoever fired first would decide everything. But if you rushed, you might miss, and if you hesitated, he would fire first. That fraction of a second between seeing him and pulling the trigger was one of the longest moments in the war. It wasn't courage that saved you, it was calm, and not everyone could stay calm when staring directly into another killer's eyes. when the Germans got better. At first, Soviet snipers had an advantage. They were better trained in camouflage. They had more patience, but the Germans learned fast. By 1943, German sharpshooters were exceptionally skilled, equipped with high-quality rifles like the Mauser K98K with advanced optics. They began using counter-sniper teams, where one man would act as bait, while another sniper watched from a hidden spot. Soviets, who had once dominated the battlefield, now found themselves hunted just as effectively. The duels became more brutal, more unpredictable. Nobody was safe anymore, not even the most experienced shooters. It's a psychological toll of knowing he's out there. Sometimes, you didn't even see the enemy sniper. You just knew. Maybe it was the sound of a distant shot. Maybe it was the way soldiers suddenly started dying, one by one. Maybe it was just instinct. But once you realized you were being hunted, every nerve in your body stayed on edge. Couldn't relax, couldn't focus. Even when you were back at camp, eating or trying to sleep, you'd feel that cold dread in your gut. He's out there. He's watching. That fear hollowed you out over time. It made some soldiers paranoid, others reckless, okay? But it never truly left. When both snipers died, sometimes sniper duels ended in mutual destruction. One Soviet sniper described how he and a German spotted each other at the same time. They both fired simultaneously. 2 bullets, 2 lives. Both men fell at the same exact moment, locked in a frozen, eternal duel. There was no winner, only silence. And in a way, that's what sniper duels were really about. Not glory, not heroism. It's 2 human beings trapped in a tiny slice of war, trying desperately to survive another day. Why? It broke them. Sniper duels weren't like regular combat. There were no explosions, no mass assaults, no roaring tanks. It was just 2 people waiting for the perfect moment to kill. You stared through your scope for so long that your mind started to unravel. You became hyper-aware of every sound, every flicker of light, every tiny movement. The longer the duel lasted, the more you lost touch with reality. It wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was just you, him, and the creeping thought that maybe he was better than you. And if he was, your life ended right there. The legacy of sniper duels. After the war, Soviet snipers rarely spoke about these duels. They talk about their confirmed kills. They talk about heroic moments in big battles. But when it came to sniper versus sniper fights, they went quiet. Because those weren't just missions. They were personal. You weren't killing an anonymous soldier in a trench. You were killing someone who was exactly like you. Someone who had the same fear, the same skill, the same grim determination. And that stayed with you forever. No winners, only survivors. In the end, sniper duels didn't create heroes. They didn't decide the fate of the war. They were just another layer of horror in a conflict already drowning in it. If you won, you lived another day. You lost, you were just another body in the ruins. And even if you survived, you carried the memory of those duels, asterisk, those long, quiet, suffocating hours staring death in the face, asterisk, for the rest of your life. That was the deadly rivalry of Soviet sniper duels, an endless, nerve-shattering test of patience, skill, and sanity. When the enemy wasn't the worst threat, how your own army could destroy you when you think about war. You imagine the enemy as the greatest danger. But for Soviet snipers in World War II, the deadliest bullet didn't always come from the German side. Sometimes it came from behind. 'Cause in Stalin's Red Army, you weren't just fighting the Nazis. You were also fighting the crushing paranoia of your own commanders, political officers, and the brutal machine of Soviet discipline. The Red Army's shadow, the NKVD. The moment you were conscripted into the Soviet military, you didn't just join an army. You stepped into a system of fear. Looming over every soldier was the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. They didn't just watch the enemy, they watched you. If you hesitated in battle, you were labeled a coward. If you retreated without orders, you were a traitor. If you spoke a word of doubt about Stalin or the war, you were marked for disappearance. And when the NKVD made you disappear, it wasn't clean or quiet. You'd be dragged out in front of your comrades and shot. No trial, no second chances. The message was clear. Fear the Germans? Yes, but fear us even more. The blocking detachments. For Soviet snipers, retreat wasn't an option. Why? Because if you turned your back on the Germans, you'd run straight into blocking detachments, special NKVD units stationed behind the front lines. Their job, to kill their own soldiers if they tried to flee. Imagine this, you're pinned down by German fire. You're out of ammunition. You can't advance, so you're trying to fall back, just to survive. And then you're shot in the back. It's not by the enemy, by your own side. It was called anti-right enforcement, but for the soldiers on the ground, it felt like a death trap. There was no way out. You fought, or you died. Either way, the Soviet state won. Snipers under suspicion. You'd think Soviet snipers were valued above all else. After all, they were highly trained, deadly accurate, and essential for morale. But in Stalin's world of paranoia, being exceptional made you dangerous. If you gained too much recognition, if your name was mentioned in too many reports, you attracted the wrong kind of attention. Political officers might start wondering, why is this sniper so successful? Is he working for himself? Is he loyal to the party? Or is he secretly planning to defect? It sounds absurd, but in a regime built on fear and suspicion, anyone could be accused of treason. And many snipers who were once praised as heroes ended up imprisoned, interrogated, or executed by their own government. The terror of political officers. In every Soviet unit, there was someone more feared than the enemy, the political officer. They weren't frontline fighters. They were watchdogs for the Communist Party. They made sure you obeyed orders. They made sure you shouted the right slogans, followed the right ideology, and stayed loyal no matter what. And if you slipped up, you said the wrong thing, hesitated in the wrong moment, or even looked unsure they could sign your death sentence on the spot. Many snipers described how the political officers watched them more closely than the Germans did. You could survive 1,000 enemy bullets, but one whispered accusation of defeatism from a political officer, and you were done. The impossible orders. Sometimes you weren't just fighting the enemy, you were fighting impossible orders. Your commanders might demand you eliminate a heavily fortified machine gun nest, but they wouldn't give you enough ammunition. Or they'd order you to hold a ruined building for 3 days without food or backup. Failure wasn't an option. It's not because you let the team down, but because failure was treason. If you refused, you'd be shot. If you tried and failed, you'd be shot. Even if you succeeded, the odds were high that you'd simply be thrown into another suicidal mission. In Stalin's army, you weren't expected to survive. You were expected to die usefully. Fear of your comrades. You couldn't even fully trust the soldiers next to you. Why? Because informants were everywhere. The NKVD encouraged soldiers to report any suspicious behavior. If you complained about the cold, someone might whisper you were undermining morale. If you cursed Stalin under your breath, someone would tell the political officer. And why wouldn't they? Turning you in might save their life. So, even in your own squad, even among people you'd fought alongside for months, you never knew who might betray you. The enemy wasn't just in the German trenches. The enemy was sometimes sleeping in the same dugout. Penalty battalions, a fate worse than death. If the Soviet command didn't execute you outright, they had another punishment waiting, Strafbats or penalty battalions. These were basically suicide units. Cowards, deserters, or anyone suspected of disloyalty were thrown into these formations and sent on the most hopeless missions, clearing minefields with no equipment, assaulting fortified positions without support, marching through artillery barrages to draw enemy fire. If you were sent to a penalty battalion, you weren't expected to come back, and many snipers who were accused, rightly or wrongly, of failing their missions ended up in these death squads. Your life wasn't yours. As a sniper, you didn't control your fate. One day, you could be hailed as a hero, awarded medals, even mentioned in Soviet newspapers as a shining example of courage. The next day, You could be labeled suspicious, dragged out of your unit, and executed without explanation. No trial. No appeal. Your family would be told nothing. Your name would vanish from the records, and the state would quietly replace you with another sniper, another disposable piece of the war machine. The constant paranoia created a strange, crushing paranoia. You were already under unimaginable stress from hunting and killing the enemy every day. But layered on top of that was the knowledge that your own side might turn on you at any moment. You were always double-checking your words, always watching the faces of your comrades, wondering who might report you, always questioning whether the mission you'd just been given was a genuine order or a trap designed to get rid of you. You weren't just fighting a war, you were surviving a regime of fear, heroes who became enemies of the people. There were countless cases where snipers became famous, only to be destroyed by the very country they served. Some were accused of exaggerating their kill counts and branded liars. Others were said to have cowardly avoided certain missions, despite having already risked their lives hundreds of times. Some were simply too well known. Stalin's Soviet Union, becoming popular, was dangerous. It made you a potential rival to the state's propaganda, so instead of honoring you, they erased you. And after the war, many decorated snipers quietly disappeared into the gulags. The chilling reality. So think about this. You're a sniper on the Eastern Front. You've survived countless German attacks. Cool. You've killed more enemy soldiers than you can count. Cool. You've crawled through snow, through rubble, through mud, soaked in blood. And after all that, it's not the Germans who might kill you. It's your own government. That's the chilling reality Soviet snipers lived with every single day. Surviving the war didn't mean freedom. Even if you somehow made it through the entire war, you weren't guaranteed peace. Many veterans came home only to be arrested by the NKVD for suspicious behavior during their service. Some were accused of having been too close to the enemy during missions. Others were charged with anti-Soviet sentiment because they decomplained about the war's horrors. And many were simply forgotten, discarded, once they were no longer useful. Mew could survive Hitler's army, only to end up in one of Stalin's prisons. Enemy within. So while the Germans were a terrifying, visible threat, the Soviet state itself was the silent, ever-present danger. You couldn't escape it. You couldn't reason with it. And you couldn't fight it. The NKVD, the political officers, the endless purges, they were like a second enemy force, one you couldn't shoot back at. For many snipers, this was worse than the war itself. Because, at least with the Germans, you knew where you stood with your own side. You never really knew. And that's what made being a Soviet sniper even more horrifying. You weren't just battling the Nazis. You were surviving a system that saw you as expendable, untrustworthy, and easily replaced. The hidden toll. How Soviet snipers faced lifelong trauma and isolation. Surviving the war didn't mean the nightmare was over. For Soviet snipers, the end of World War II wasn't a clean break between horror and peace. It was the beginning of a new kind of suffering, one that followed them home, haunted their sleep, and made them strangers in their own country. 'Cause even if they lived, a part of them stayed behind on the battlefield, buried in the ruins of Stalingrad, in the frozen forests near Leningrad, in the endless killing fields of the Eastern Front. Killing wasn't just a skill, it became a weight. Every sniper knew their mission was to kill. But here's the thing, pulling the trigger from hundreds of meters away might feel clean in the moment, but over time, the faces start to blur together. The men you shot down weren't nameless enemies anymore. They were soldiers, fathers, sons. You saw the way they fell. Sometimes you saw the fear in their eyes just before you ended their lives, and you couldn't stop seeing even years later. Some Soviet snipers admitted that after the war, they would wake up in the middle of the night hearing voices, not the voices of their comrades, but the voices of the men they killed. And no matter how much they drank, no matter how much they tried to drown it out with work or silence, the memories stayed. PTSD before it had a name. Back then, there was no term like post-traumatic stress disorder. There was just weakness. If you were a soldier who couldn't sleep, who shook uncontrollably, who had flashbacks, you were seen as cowardly. The Soviet state didn't recognize psychological trauma. They believed a true communist soldier should be strong, unbreakable. So what happened? Snipers bottled it all up. They didn't talk about the nightmares. They didn't talk about the panic attacks when they heard a loud noise that sounded like artillery. They didn't talk about the times they froze, seeing a crowd and suddenly imagining German soldiers everywhere. They stayed silent, because if they spoke, they risked being labeled mentally unstable, or worse, politically unreliable. Coming home to nothing. Imagine you survived years on the front. You fought through winter, hunger, fear, and the endless grind of sniper missions. You come home expecting some kind of welcome. But when many Soviet snipers returned, they found nothing waiting for them. Their homes had been destroyed. Their families had been killed or displaced. Some came back to find strangers living in their houses. Some didn't even have a home to return to, just rubble. There was no therapy, no community of veterans who gathered to share their experiences. You were simply expected to go back to normal life, even though you weren't the same person anymore. A hero until you weren't. Some Soviet snipers were briefly celebrated as war heroes. Their photos were printed in newspapers. They were given medals. They were paraded as symbols of Soviet strength. But that glory didn't last. After the war, the same government that praised them became suspicious. If you were too well known, too respected by the people, you were seen as a potential threat to Stalin's image. So many famous snipers were quietly pushed aside. They weren't allowed to speak publicly. Some were reassigned to meaningless jobs. Others were accused of political unreliability and sent to the gulags. It was a cruel twist. You risked your life for your country, and then your country turned its back on you, living with invisible wounds. Even the snipers who avoided political persecution still carried invisible wounds. Some couldn't hold down jobs because they were too unstable. Some drank themselves into oblivion. Others became isolated, unable to connect with anyone who hadn't lived through the same horrors. They couldn't explain why they flinched at sudden noises. They couldn't explain why they avoided crowds. They couldn't explain why they sometimes sat up all night staring out the window as if waiting for an attack. How do you explain that you spent years looking through a scope, searching for human targets, and now you can't stop scanning for danger even in your own village? It's endless silence. Many snipers simply never talked about the war. Not to their friends, not to their spouses, not even to their children. They locked it all inside, because what could they say? How do you describe to someone who never saw combat what it felt like to become a weapon, until you admit that you lost track of how many people you killed? How do you explain that sometimes you felt proud, and sometimes you felt sick to your stomach? So they stayed silent, and that silence became a wall between them and the rest of the world, haunted by faces. One sniper described how he couldn't go to crowded places anymore. Not because he was scared of people, but because in every crowd, he saw the faces of the men he'd killed. The German soldier who was just lighting a cigarette when the bullet hit him. The young conscript barely old enough to shave who looked terrified just before he died. The officer who collapsed into the snow, still clutching a photograph of his family. The memories came back in flashes, like photographs burned into the mind. They weren't just soldiers, they were human. And as much as the Soviet state tried to make you see the enemy as less than human, deep down, every sniper knew the truth. You didn't kill monsters, you killed people. And that realization never left you. The guilt of survival. Survival itself was another kind of torment, because while you lived, so many of your comrades didn't. You might remember the sniper who trained alongside you, but took a bullet on his first mission, or the spotter who saved your life once, only to be blown apart the next day. You couldn't stop asking yourself, why them? Why not me? Survivor's guilt ate away at many veterans. They couldn't feel joy, They couldn't feel peace, because every moment of life felt like it was borrowed from the dead. No escape from the regime. Even after the war, you weren't free from the Soviet state. If you tried to speak openly about the horrors you saw, you risked being accused of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda. If you wrote down your memories in a diary, someone could report you. Even your trauma wasn't really yours, belonged to the party, and you were expected to bury it. So many veterans destroyed their wartime letters, their photographs, even their medals, not because they wanted to forget, but because they didn't want the wrong person to see them and start asking dangerous questions. The body never fully healed. On top of the mental wounds, there were the physical ones. Snipers often carried untreated injury shrapnel in their bodies, nerve damage from frostbite, chronic pain from months spent lying in the cold with little food. But medical care after the war was minimal. You were lucky to get basic painkillers. Most veterans just learned to live with the pain, limping through the rest of their lives as reminders of the years they spent crawling through ruined cities and frozen forests. It's loneliness after the front. And perhaps the deepest wound of all was loneliness. Because after the war, no one understood you anymore. Civilians had lived through fear and hunger. Yes, but they hadn't seen what you saw, okay? Didn't T know what it was like to watch someone slide in through the lens of a scope, okay? Didn't know the smell of gunpowder mixed with blood in the freezing air, okay? Didn't know the silence after a battle when the only sound is the wind moving over the dead. So you felt alone, even in a crowded room, even surrounded by family. You were alone with the ghosts of the war. Some never stopped fighting. A few veterans couldn't let go of the war at all. They kept their rifles hidden, just in case. They memorized escape routes from their homes. They still moved through forests silently, like they were on a mission. To them, the war never really ended. It just changed locations. The battlefield was now inside their minds, the quiet tragedy. So while the Soviet Union celebrated victory, many snipers quietly fell apart. Some drank themselves into early graves. Some took their own lives. Others lived long, silent years, unable to share the burden they carried. And history mostly forgot them, because the Soviet state didn't want to talk about the cost of its victory, the broken men and women it left behind. They wanted heroes, not haunted survivors. So the real story stayed hidden. Think about that. Even if you survived the Germans, even if you survived Stalin's paranoia, even if you came home in one piece, you never truly escaped. You carried the war inside you forever. That was the final punishment for being a Soviet sniper. The forgotten women snipers. Heroes who paid a heavy price. When you imagine a sniper, you probably think of a rugged, battle-hardened man. But on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union did something no other major power dared. They recruited women into the ranks of snipers. They were young. Many were barely out of high school. Some were still teenagers. Okay. They swapped their school uniforms for military fatigues, their textbooks for rifles. And while they became deadly warriors, their lives would never be the same. For women, being a Soviet sniper wasn't just dangerous. It was a double burden, fighting both the enemy and the crushing weight of sexism, trauma, and betrayal by the very country they served. Why the Soviets chose women snipers? At first, it might seem surprising. Why would the Soviet Union want women on the front lines? The answer was partly desperation. The Nazi invasion had torn through Soviet defenses, killing millions of soldiers. By 1942, the Red Army was running out of men. But there was also a cold, practical reason. Women were seen as ideal snipers. They had better patience for long waits in hidden positions, smaller, quieter movements, making them harder to detect, steadier hands, which improved accuracy, sharper eyesight, and a natural ability to judge distances. So, thousands of women were sent to sniper schools. Some had grown up hunting with their fathers. Others had never even held a gun before the war. Within months, they were transformed into lethal markswomen, the famous faces behind the rifle. Names like Ludmila Pavlichenko became legendary. She was one of the deadliest snipers in history, credited with over 300 confirmed kills. She stalked German soldiers across the ruins of Sevastopol and became a symbol of Soviet resistance. The Soviets paraded her as a hero, even sending her to the United States and Britain to rally support. But for every Pavlichenko, there were hundreds of nameless women who quietly vanished into the chaos of war. Many didn't survive. And those who did came home to a world that didn't know what to do with them. The training was brutal. Women weren't given any special treatment in sniper school. They crawled through mud and snow. They slept outdoors in freezing conditions. They learned how to camouflage themselves with branches, mud, even dead leaves to blend into the terrain. They practiced crawling for hours without making a single sound. They learned to shoot in complete silence, controlling their breathing so even the faintest movement wouldn't give them away. And they were taught one chilling lesson over and over again. If you are caught by the Germans, they won't treat you like a soldier. They will torture you. They will humiliate you. You cannot allow yourself to be captured alive. So every woman sniper carried one last bullet for herself. War was harsher on women. Being a woman didn't make the war easier. In fact, it made it worse. 'Cause if you were captured, the Germans wouldn't just kill you, they would degrade you. Women snipers were hated by German soldiers. They saw them as unnatural, as monsters who dared to kill men. A German unit caught a Soviet female sniper. They often subjected her to unimaginable cruelty before execution. The women knew this. They went into every mission knowing they couldn't afford a single mistake. One wrong move, and their end would be far worse than death. Living like a ghost, female snipers spent weeks in isolation. They hid in trees, in trenches, in abandoned buildings. They couldn't talk. They couldn't move during daylight. Times they had to stay completely still for 12 to 15 hours straight, holding the same position while their legs went numb and frostbite crept into their bones. They couldn't risk a fire to stay warm. They couldn't eat hot food. They couldn't even relieve themselves. Normally everything had to be done silently, discreetly, with no trace left behind. They lived like ghosts. And in those endless stretches of silence, many women began to lose touch with what normal life even felt like. Sisterhood in the shadows. Despite the isolation, women snipers formed tight bonds with one another. They trained together, fought together, and often shared the same sniper nests. They called each other sisters because, in many cases, they were closer than family. But those bonds were fragile. At any moment, a sister could be taken out by a stray bullet. You might spend weeks crawling and hiding with a partner, whispering only a few words a day, and then watch her die in front of you without making a sound, and you couldn't cry out, You couldn't even stop to mourn, If you moved, the enemy would see you, and you'd be next. They were heroes on the battlefield, but not at home. After the war, many female snipers expected recognition. They thought they'd return to a grateful nation. But instead, they came home to suspicion and stigma. Men didn't see them as heroes. They saw them as unnatural. Some whispered that women who went to the front had been loose, implying they slept with officers. Others saw them as too hardened, too unfeminine, tainted by the war. Many veterans were told to forget the war and quietly blend back into society. But how could they? They had seen too much, They had done too much. And now, the same society they fought to protect didn't even want to look them in the eye. Marriage, family, almost impossible. For many women snipers, starting a family after the war was nearly impossible. Some were physically unable to have children due to injuries or the effects of extreme starvation and cold. Others simply couldn't find husbands. Men didn't want wives who had been on the front lines, who knew how to kill. There was a deep, unspoken fear. If she could shoot a man at 500 meters, what's to stop her from turning that rifle on me? Many of these women spent the rest of their lives alone, their wartime experiences locked inside them. The mental scars were deeper than anyone knew. Like their male counterparts, women snipers came home with invisible wounds. They suffered from nightmares, flashbacks, and endless guilt. Some couldn't stand the sight of rifles ever again. Others clung to their weapons, unable to let go of the only thing that had kept them alive. Because Soviet society didn't acknowledge trauma, they were left to suffer in silence. There was no therapy, no support groups, just silence. Some tried to tell their stories. A few women, like Pavlichenko, wrote memoirs or gave interviews, but even then, they had to sanitize the truth. They couldn't talk about the sexual violence they'd witnessed. They couldn't admit the moments of fear, the moral doubts, the times they wanted to run away. They had to present a picture of the ideal Soviet woman soldier, brave, loyal, unshakable. Anything less risked being accused of anti-Soviet propaganda. So the real stories of most women snipers remained hidden, buried with them when they died. Their names were erased. After the war, the Soviet government didn't like to highlight the role of women in combat. Yes, they had been useful during the emergency. But in peacetime, women were expected to return to traditional roles: mothers, factory workers. So many of the women snipers' names were simply forgotten. Their medals gathered dust. Their records disappeared into archives. And for decades, history barely mentioned them. They were erased. Why their sacrifice matters. But think about what they endured. They were young women who gave up everything: youth, innocence, even their futures, to defend their country. They fought in conditions that would break most men. They became some of the deadliest snipers in history, holding the line when the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. And yet, after all that, they came home to loneliness, judgment, and silence. They were heroes who paid a price they never stopped paying. The final tragedy. The war took away their childhoods. The post-war years took away their dignity. In time, took away their stories. Now, only fragments remain: faded photographs, scattered memoirs, and the haunting question: what was it really like to be a woman sniper in the Soviet army? The truth is more complicated, more painful, and far more human than the propaganda ever showed. So while we talk about Soviet snipers as a whole, we can't forget these women. They weren't just fighters, students, dreamers, and they were forever changed by the war in ways the world will never fully understand. Betrayal by the motherland. When Soviet snipers became enemies of the state. Imagine this: you've spent years crawling through mud, snow, and rubble. You've lived like a shadow, taken hundreds of lives to protect your homeland, and survived battles that killed almost everyone around you. You're a war hero. You should be celebrated, protected, respected. But instead, when the war ends, you find yourself looking over your shoulder, wondering if the knock at your door in the middle of the night is the NKVD Stalin as secret police coming to drag you away. Because, in the twisted logic of Stalin's Soviet Union, even the most loyal soldiers could suddenly become enemies of the state. And yes, this happened to snipers, too. The war was over, but the fear was just beginning. When World War II ended in 1945, Soviet soldiers came home expecting peace. They thought their sacrifices would finally be rewarded. But they didn't understand how deeply Stalin's regime distrusted its own people. You see, Stalin had a paranoid obsession with enemies within. He believed that anyone who had seen the outside world, even occupied territories, or had interacted with foreigners could be contaminated with Western ideas. When soldiers returned from the front, instead of being welcomed as heroes, many were treated with suspicion, and snipers were especially vulnerable. Why snipers were targets of suspicion? Snipers were an elite force. They worked in small, autonomous units. They often operated behind enemy lines. They sometimes had contact with local civilians in occupied areas. And because of the nature of their work, they were harder to monitor than regular infantry. To Stalin, this made them dangerous. That skills that could threaten the state's precision shooting, stealth, survival tactics. They had seen too much, experienced too much autonomy. And, worst of all, some had been celebrated abroad, like Ludmila Pavlichenko, who toured the United States and Britain. In Stalin's eyes, anyone who had foreign admirers was automatically suspicious, from hero to potential traitor. So how did the betrayal happen? It often started small. A sniper would be called in for debriefing. The NKVD would question them about their time at the front. Did you ever have contact with enemy civilians? Did you see any fellow soldiers behave suspiciously? Did you ever doubt the orders of your superiors? Sometimes they were asked trick questions to see if they'd slip up. Then came the accusations. You were behind enemy lines. How do we know you weren't collaborating? Why did you survive when so many others didn't? What were you doing out there? We heard rumors you spoke with Americans during your trip. What did you tell them? It didn't matter that they'd risked their lives for the Soviet Union. All that mattered was that they could be a threat now, rest in the middle of the night. Once suspicion fell on the sniper, things moved quickly. One night, a black car would pull up. Men in plain clothes would knock on the door. They'd give you 5 minutes to gather your things. You'd be told you were being taken in for questioning, and often you'd never come home again. Some were sent to Lubyanka prison in Moscow, a place notorious for brutal interrogations. Others were quietly packed onto trains bound for Siberian labor camps. There was no trial, no defense, just silence. The Gulag, a different kind of hell. For a sniper who survived years of war, you might think nothing could be worse. But the Gulag system was its own nightmare. Endless freezing winters, forced labor in mines, logging camps, and construction projects with almost no food, beatings for the slightest infraction, disease spreading like wildfire, and the bitter realization that you weren't even a prisoner of war, you were a prisoner of your own government. Many former snipers didn't survive the camps. Their names disappeared into dusty archives, marked as traitors or anti-Soviet elements. Why did Stalin do it? It's easy to ask, why betray your own heroes? But in Stalin's mind, it made perfect sense. He was obsessed with control. And soldiers, especially elite ones, like snipers, were hard to control. They had proven they could act independently, make life or death decisions on their own, and survive in extreme conditions. That made them too powerful, even if they didn't realize it themselves. Also, by turning heroes into enemies, Stalin sent a clear message. No one is untouchable. No one is above the party. This was a way to keep the entire population in a constant state of fear. Not even the famous were safe, okay? Even some of the most famous Soviet war heroes fell under suspicion. Take Zoya Kosmo-Demianskaya's brother, Alexander. He was a celebrated soldier, but later investigated. Or Alexander Pechersky, the leader of the Sobibor uprising, praised in wartime propaganda, but later sidelined and monitored. Ludmila Pavlichenko herself, despite her fame as a sniper with over 300 kills, wasn't immune. After the war, she was carefully watched. Her foreign contacts made her a person of interest. Though she wasn't sent to the Gulag, her career stalled, okay? And she lived the rest of her life quietly, under the shadow of suspicion. How paranoia destroyed trust. The betrayal of Soviet snipers was part of a bigger pattern. After the war, millions of Soviet soldiers were screened by the NKVD. Entire units were disbanded. Veterans were sent to filtration camps to be interrogated. Some were cleared. Others vanished into the prison system. It created an atmosphere where no one trusted anyone. You couldn't talk about your war experiences openly. Can't admit if you met Western soldiers or seen the horrors of occupied Europe, cause any of that could be used against you. The silence of survivors. Those who survived the purges and returned from interrogation rarely spoke about it. They learned to keep their heads down. They didn't tell their families what happened. They didn't tell their children. They simply disappeared into the background, living quiet, unremarkable lives, haunted by the knowledge that one wrong word could have destroyed them again. And because of this silence, entire chapters of history were lost. The psychological toll of betrayal. For a sniper, betrayal by the state was sometimes harder to bear than the war itself. In battle, at least, the enemy was clear. You knew who was trying to kill you. When your own country turned on you, it shattered something deeper. It's a sense of pride you had in your service. It's a belief that your sacrifices meant something. The hope that you'd earned a better future. All of that was replaced by fear, disillusionment, and bitterness. The Cold War made it worse. As the Cold War began, paranoia only deepened. Anyone who had been in contact with Western allies during the war was under constant surveillance. Even snipers who had fought side by side with British or American soldiers were now seen as potential Western spies. Some were reassigned to remote postings, far from cities. Others were forced to take menial jobs and live under unofficial blacklists, barred from promotions or higher education. They were alive, but in a way, their lives were over. Rehabilitation came too late. It was in until decades later, after Stalin's death in 1953, that some veterans were officially rehabilitated. Their names were cleared. Their medals were returned. But by then, many had already died, either in the camps or from the toll of years of hardship. For the survivors, the recognition felt hollow. No apology could erase what they had endured. No medal could bring back the years stolen from them. It's a final cruel twist. And here's the most chilling part. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many of these stories remained hidden. The archives were incomplete. The families of purged snipers never got full answers about what happened. Some names remain missing to this day. Their fates a mystery, buried in the ruins of Stalin's paranoia, from hero to ghost. So, what does it mean to be a sniper who survived the war, only to be erased by your own government? It means you become a ghost. A ghost who once crawled through battlefields, a ghost who once struck fear into the enemy, and a ghost who now lingers in history, forgotten, betrayed, and silenced by the very land you bled for. Why this betrayal still matters? Because it shows the dark side of war beyond the battlefield. It wasn't just about fighting Nazis. It was about surviving a regime that treated its own heroes as disposable tools. It's a reminder that in totalitarian systems, loyalty is never enough. You can give everything and still lose it all. So while we remember Soviet snipers for their deadly precision and battlefield courage, we can't forget what happened after the shooting stopped. For many, the real nightmare didn't end with the war. It began after the victory celebrations were over. Life after the crosshairs. How surviving snipers tried to rebuild their lives. What happens when you've spent years living as a ghost on the battlefield? When you've been trained to kill, to stalk, to blend into the shadows, and then suddenly you're expected to become an ordinary citizen again. For the Soviet snipers who somehow survived World War II and avoided the secret police, life after the war was complicated. You'd think that surviving hell would bring peace. But for many of these sharpshooters, peace felt like a foreign land they didn't know how to navigate, from the battlefield to the bureaucracy. When the guns finally went silent in 1945, the Soviet Union was in ruins. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Tens of millions were dead. Industry was shattered. So, returning soldiers weren't welcomed with parades and prosperity. They came home to shortages, hunger, and endless reconstruction projects. For snipers, there were very few normal jobs. What do you do with someone who knows nothing but how to stalk and kill? Some were absorbed into the MVD as guards or police snipers. Others were sent to work in factories, on farms, or in construction. But many found the transition impossible. The problem of normal. Imagine trying to sit at a dinner table, surrounded by family, after years of living on adrenaline and fear. Imagine waking up in a warm bed after sleeping in trenches, bombed out buildings, and frozen forests. For most people, that would feel like relief. But for a sniper, it felt unnatural. So many suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. But back then, the Soviet Union didn't believe in such things. They called it war nerves, or dismissed it as weakness. So snipers who had spent years calmly pulling the trigger now found themselves haunted by the faces of the men they killed. They couldn't explain it to anyone. They just drank, or stayed silent, or disappeared, haunted by the ghosts of their kills. Every sniper kept a kill tally during the war. It was a way to measure success. But after the war, those numbers became ghosts sniper might remember. The German soldier who stopped to smoke a cigarette just before they shot him. The young face of an enemy barely older than a boy. The slow, quiet moments waiting for the perfect shot. Then the instant when life vanished. These memories didn't go away. They crept in during the night. They made some snipers avoid crowds because they couldn't stop imagining what it would be like to aim into a group of people. They made others so paranoid that they kept hidden weapons around their homes. The silence of the war heroes. For those who weren't purged, there was still a heavy weight. They couldn't talk about what really happened. Propaganda painted snipers as clean, heroic, almost superhuman figures. The reality was darker. Sometimes they had to shoot wounded soldiers to keep them from falling into enemy hands. Sometimes they were ordered to execute Soviet deserters. Sometimes they killed not because they wanted to, but because survival left no choice. But none of that fit the official story. So surviving snipers learned to keep their mouths shut. They'd sit through ceremonies, accept medals, and smile for the cameras. But inside, they were still back in the ruined cities and frozen forests, trying to build families. Many snipers were young, barely adults when the war ended, so naturally, they tried to start families. But love was difficult for someone who had lived for years without human warmth. Some could never fully connect. They were emotionally distant, unable to express tenderness after years of emotional numbness. Others were prone to sudden outbursts of rage, triggered by loud noises or even the sound of fireworks. And because there was no understanding of PTSD, their spouses often thought they were simply cold or broken. So marriages fell apart. Others endured, but always with a quiet, invisible wall between the sniper and their family. Alcohol, the quiet escape. Vodka became a silent companion for many veterans. It dulled the memories. It made the nightmares fade, at least for a few hours. But it also ruined countless lives. Many snipers, unable to find peace, slipped into alcoholism. They'd spend their pensions in dimly lit bars, surrounded by other veterans who also couldn't sleep at night. And slowly, they'd fade into obscurity, no longer the sharp-eyed warriors they once were. Just tired old men drinking away their past. Some found new purpose. Not every sniper was lost to despair. A few managed to channel their skills into new paths. Some became marksmanship instructors, training the next generation of soldiers. Others worked with youth programs, teaching, shooting, and discipline to Soviet school children. A handful even became writers, sharing sanitized versions of their wartime experiences in memoirs, though they had to carefully avoid any details that might anger the government. But these were the exceptions. Most simply faded back into ordinary life, never speaking of the war again. The women who carried the weight. It's important to remember that many Soviet snipers were women like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Rosa Shanina, and Nina Lobkovskaya. And for them, life after the war carried extra burdens. In a deeply patriarchal society, female veterans were often seen as unwomanly. Some men didn't want to marry a woman who had killed. Some even accused them of being tainted because they'd served on the front. So these women, who had risked everything for their country, often returned to loneliness and judgment. They rarely spoke about their experiences, fearing gossip or rejection. And so their stories were buried even deeper. The Cold War years. As the Cold War set in, the Soviet Union turned its veterans into political tools. On certain anniversaries, the state would parade them as symbols of Soviet strength. Wear their medals and smile for photos. But outside those ceremonies, many were ignored. Some veterans struggled to get proper housing or medical care. Many lived in poverty, their wartime heroism reduced to a dusty file in some government archive. Meeting the enemy again. One strange thing happened decades later. In the 1960s and 70s, some Soviet veterans secretly corresponded with former German soldiers. They wanted closure. They wanted to talk to the only people who truly understood what they'd been through. So few even met their former enemies in person, in rare exchanges allowed by veterans organizations. And in those moments, they often realized something haunting. The men they had hunted were just like them, scared, trying to survive. That realization made the memories even heavier. The ones who couldn't take it. Not all snipers managed to adapt. Some unable to handle civilian life simply disappeared. They moved to remote villages or forests, living as hermits. Others ended their own lives quietly, unable to carry the weight any longer. And because the Soviet Union never wanted to admit its war heroes were struggling, these deaths were rarely recorded honestly. They were written off as illness or accident. The few who were remembered after Stalin's death. Some surviving snipers were finally recognized. Lyudmila Pavlichenko toured schools, sharing carefully curated stories. Rosa Shanina became a symbol of youthful bravery, after her diary was published posthumously. But for every famous sniper, there were thousands whose names no one knew. Men and women who killed hundreds to defend their country, only to live and die in complete anonymity. Life in the shadows. So what was life like for a sniper after the war? It was a strange mix of pride and silence. They were proud to have survived, but they couldn't share the truth of what they'd done. They were respected in official ceremonies, but in private, they often felt alienated, haunted, and forgotten. In many ways, they lived as they had during the war, quietly in the shadows. Why their struggle still matters. Because it reminds us that war doesn't end when the shooting stops. The battlefield follows you home. It lives in your mind, your body, your relationships. And when a government treats its veterans as tools rather than people, the damage lasts for generations. From crosshairs to oblivion. So in the end, life after the crosshairs wasn't really life at Al, it was survival, just in a different form. The sniper story didn't end with victory. It ended in silence. A silence that still echoes today in forgotten graves and unspoken memories. So, while we may remember the fearless Soviet snipers of World War II, we also need to remember what happened to them when the war ended. They came home, but they never truly returned. Legends, myths, and forgotten truths. How Soviet snipers were remembered when the final shots of World War II faded into history. The Soviet Union faced a new battle not on the fields of Europe, but in the minds of its people. The war had been won at a staggering cost. And now the state needed heroes. But here's the strange part: the truth about Soviet snipers didn't survive the war intact. Instead, their legacy became a mix of propaganda, legend, and carefully crafted silence. The creation of model heroes. In the aftermath of the war, the Soviet government understood the power of storytelling. The people were exhausted. Cities were in ruins. Millions of families were grieving. So the state needed figures of hope, symbols that would remind everyone why the suffering had been worth it. That's where the sniper legends came in. Certain names were elevated to near mythical status. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the Lady Death, with 309 confirmed kills. Vasily Zaitsev, the hero of Stalingrad, said to have dueled a German master sniper. Rosa Shanina, the young woman sniper, who became a tragic wartime icon. They were paraded in newspapers, featured in books, even celebrated in Soviet cinema. But here, as the twist, the reality of their lives was far more complicated than the official story. How propaganda cleaned the blood off their hands. The Soviet state didn't want its people thinking about the messy, brutal reality of sniper warfare. They didn't talk about psychological toll of killing up close, the cold-blooded executions of wounded enemies, the moral ambiguity of shooting someone who never saw you. Instead, snipers were portrayed as pure defenders of the motherland, calm, noble, almost superhuman. Their kills weren't described as deaths. They were eliminations of fascist scum. The war was painted in black and white terms. Good Soviet heroes versus evil Nazi villains. And any details that didn't fit that narrative, they vanished into the archives. The myth of the duel at Stalingrad. Take Vasily Zaitsev, for example. His most famous story is the sniper duel with Major Keeg, the supposed German master sniper sent to kill him during the Battle of Stalingrad. It's an incredible tale to elite marksmen stalking each other in the ruins of the city, a deadly chess match with rifles. But historians now believe it probably never happened. There's no German record of any major Kinch, no evidence such a duel ever took place. It was likely a piece of wartime propaganda invented to boost Soviet morale during the grimmest days of Stalingrad. But the story stuck. Even today, people still repeat it as fact because it feels too dramatic to question. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the legend versus the woman. Then there's Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the most famous female sniper in history. After the war, she toured the United States and Britain, meeting Eleanor Roosevelt and charming foreign audiences. The Soviet press called her Lady Death, but what they didn't talk about was her loneliness. her struggles with PTSD, the fact that after the war, she was pushed into an ordinary bureaucratic job, is forgotten by the very system that had once used her face for posters. She was celebrated as a living legend, but her real pain stayed hidden behind a smile. The state demanded. Forgotten names, lost lives. For every sniper the state turned into a hero, thousands more disappeared into obscurity. The Soviet archives are full of nameless soldiers with staggering kill counts who were never mentioned again. Why? Because not everyone was politically reliable. Some were executed after the war for supposed disloyalty. Cool. Some were sent to the Gulag because they spoke the wrong words or asked the wrong questions. And once someone fell out of favor, their name was erased from history. They became non-persons, their wartime service buried in silence, war diaries that never saw the light. Many snipers kept diaries during the war. Some wrote about the horror of killing a human being up close. Some wrote about the fear, the cold, the hunger, and the endless waiting in ruins. A few were brutally honest about how they didn't feel like heroes at all. They just wanted to survive. But after the war, those diaries were often confiscated. Only sanitized excerpts were ever published. Anything that made the Soviet war effort look messy or human was locked away. So the real voices of the snipers were silenced. The female snipers' vanishing act. Women played a huge role in the sniper corps. They were smaller, quieter, more patient, perfect for the deadly work of waiting in ambush. Tana, and during the war, they were praised in newspapers as symbols of Soviet equality. But after the war, they were told to go back to the kitchen and return to traditional roles. Many were treated with suspicion, even contempt. Some men refused to marry them, believing a woman who had killed couldn't be a proper wife. So their stories faded away. Even Rosa Shanina, the young sniper whose diary survived, became a tragic curiosity rather than a celebrated hero. How the Cold War distorted the story. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union needed to polish its image, so sniper legends were reshaped to fit the new political needs. The messy, realistic accounts of brutal street fighting were replaced by glorious, clean victories. The snipers were described as calm, almost clinical, never struggling with doubt or trauma. They became propaganda tools again this time to show the world how disciplined and heroic Soviet soldiers had been. Meanwhile, in the West, films and books often demonized Soviet snipers, portraying them as ruthless killers, so the truth was lost between two extremes. Soviet propaganda, making them flawless heroes. Western propaganda, making them soulless villains. The reality of human beings doing terrible things in impossible conditions was nowhere to be found. Hollywood and the pop culture war. Decades later, Hollywood picked up the sniper myth. The 2001 film Enemy at the Gates dramatized the supposed duel between Vasily Zaitsev and Major Kinnick. It turned the sniper story into a thrilling action romance. But it also distorted history even further. The film ignored the reality of starvation, disease, and the true horror of Stalingrad, focusing instead on a cat-and-mouse game that likely never happened. Millions of people saw it and believed it was history, and so the myth became even stronger than the truth. The hidden trauma. One thing almost no post-war stories mentioned was the trauma snipers carried. In Soviet books and films, snipers were always calm, unshaken by what they'd done. But in private, many veterans confessed they were haunted for the rest of their lives. They dreamed of the men they had killed. They avoided looking through scopes or binoculars because it reminded them of those long, tense hours waiting for a target. This side of the story was buried because the state needed strong, unbroken heroes, not human beings with nightmares, rediscovering the forgotten truths. It wasn't until after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that researchers began uncovering the real stories of the snipers. Old diaries were published for the first time. Historians gained access to military archives that had been sealed for decades. And slowly, the truth emerged. Many confirmed kills were exaggerated for propaganda. Many snipers were purged or silenced after the war. And the psychological cost was far greater than anyone admitted. This new wave of research showed that the snipers were not just killers. they were also victims of a brutal system that used them and then abandoned them. Why myths persist. Okay, even today, the myths about Soviet snipers remain powerful because they're simple. They're easy to understand. The idea of a lone sharpshooter calmly defending their homeland feels inspiring. The messy truth that these were traumatized, cold, conflicted human beings who were sometimes forced into impossible choices is harder to face. So the myths live on in books, films, and internet stories. Meanwhile, the real snipers are still waiting to be fully understood, what their legacy really means. So what's the legacy of the Soviet snipers? It's not just about marksmanship or bravery. It's about how war twists the human soul and how governments manipulate the memory of that war for their own purposes. It's about how heroes are made, not just by their deeds, but by the stories told about them. And it's a reminder that every legend has a shadow. Behind every medal is a hidden cost. Behind every heroic story is a silence no one wants to break, the final fade into history. Most Soviet snipers are now gone. Their voices are silent. Some were buried with honors. Others were buried in unmarked graves. And their stories remain caught between what really happened and what the world wanted to believe. In the end, their greatest tragedy may not be what they did during the war, but how they were remembered afterward. So, when you hear the name of a legendary sniper, remember this. You're not just hearing history. You're hearing the version of history someone wanted you to believe.